Raiding has always been an integral part of the endgame cycle of any MMORPG, from the text-based DikuMUD to all modern MMOs like World of Warcraft, Runescape, Final Fantasy and so many more. But where exactly did raiding originate, and what changes has this activity seen through the many years of the MMORPG evolution? MMORPGs, or massively multiplayer online role-playing games, have a long and rich history within gaming, spanning from the early days of text-based games that would be a simple black screen with white writing to the modern day where it's a constantly changing and evolving genre. The term MMORPG was coined by Richard Garriott, the creator of the Ultimate Game series, to refer to those games and their social communities. Previous to this, they were generally called Graphical MUDs, or multi-user dungeons, with connections existing in Maze War from 1974, MUD 1 from 1978, and the roguelike MUD Ion the Kesmai on CompuServe. Though MMORPGs have existed for a very long time, raiding itself isn't that old, with its origins lying in the multi-user dungeon known as DikuMUD. Commonly referred to as just Diku, the game originated from the computer science department of the University of Copenhagen and became one of the first popular and freely available games that resembled gameplay to Dungeons & Dragons. The largest gameplay element within it was hack and slash, which quickly became a staple of the genre. It's been difficult to find exactly what a raid looked like on Diku from researching for this video, but over everything I've read, one thing is clear: Diku has influenced near enough every single MMORPG within the genre. One such heavy influence was in the 1999 Everquest, a 3D fantasy-themed MMORPG that was commercially the first successful MMORPG to employ a 3D game engine, and went on to further influence a lot of other games and brought the concept of raiding into modern MMORPGs, being considered one of the greatest video games ever made, winning numerous awards. But what did raiding in Everquest look like? The first raids weren't what we know them for today: multi-boss instances with player caps, with some offering flexible approaches to numbers and varying degrees of difficulty. In fact, the first 3 raid bosses in Everquest were just sat in endgame zones waiting for adventurers to descend upon them. Lady Vox waited within the Permafrost Keep, Lord Nagafen within Nagafen's Lair, and Finagel Ortropus, who resided within Kedge Keep. Each boss had their own strengths and demanded adventurers to have increased resistance to certain types of attack, whilst all offering unique mechanics and encounters. What was surprising to learn was that there were no player caps for these bosses. You could try to muster up as many people as possible to take on these foes, and I imagine that a lot of people did. Here's a small clip that shows a part of the battle for Lady Vox from about 10 years ago that's been filmed on a phone, but it shows an early 2006 Lady Vox kill. I imagine the difficulty of the raid bosses was considered challenging back in the days of release, which I unfortunately couldn't find footage for. But reading through the little bit I could find, it seemed like these bosses were more akin to what we know as world bosses in a modern MMORPG, out in the open ready to face off against anyone who dares, with lengthy respawn times which isn't as common now, such as Lady Vox having 7 odd days to respawn before she could be taken on again. Though these one-off bosses provided a great challenge, they pale in comparison to the first proper raid of the game. Everquest also brought out its first full raid in the same year of its release, the Plane of Hate. Dubbed as the hardest raid in MMOs during its time by Jeremy Ray on fandom.com, it seems like the sprawling dungeon really took a toll on guilds and individual players alike. The Plane of Hate was in fact one of numerous planes within the game that existed before the first expansion, alongside the Plane of War and Plane of Air to name some. Though the Plane of Hate was, as Jeremy Ray describes, the perfect mix of design difficulty, technical challenges and human stamina requirements. It wasn't just a regular we raid every Thursday and Monday at 7 PM for 2 hours type of deal. No, it was a marathon that some guilds even prepared sleeping shifts for, as allegedly a 24-hour run wasn't unheard of. I mean, the final boss was literally a god of the fictional universe that it's set in, Inoruk, the Prince of Hate. Though when you hear plane you immediately think of a vast open space, this raid was anything but. Most of the fights would take place in cramped small corridors, and one of the main difficulties was even entering the raid. Though it took a few minutes to portal everyone inside, making a stronghold could take a long time. If one patrol was alerted, they alerted many more mobs that would descend upon the entrance and wipe out anyone who was unfortunate enough to be stood there. This was a pivotal moment for guilds, even establishing a foothold within the raid was a dangerous endeavour, let alone tackling the mini-bosses and Inoruk himself. You might think to yourself, well, you can die but it's not that big of a deal. Just respawn and everyone can run in again. Well, back then if you died there were a lot more consequences than there are now in modern MMOs. Though the penalty for dying in Everquest changed a few times, when it first released you could lose a level on your character for dying. This further meant that you could lose your held gear and items until you ran back to your corpse to claim them within a certain amount of time. Kind of like what Runescape did back in the day. But it meant that you had to corpse run naked or with weaker gear, of which you'd most likely just die again, and at the gates of the Plane of Hate, you'd see a sea of skeletons and lost gear. To finish off about the Plane of Hate, it's worth mentioning the last boss fight, the pinnacle of any raid. You had to make sure you cleared every single mob in the raid, which was a tricky task since patrols could spot you through walls if you were close enough to them. But even then, when ascending to the second floor, your positioning had to be exact in case you aggroed monsters above you. I did say you had to clear every mob, and that is just down to the fact if you pulled in a ruck without doing so, they'd be sprinting through the door to help their master ensure his success. But do you think we're done? No. Defeating the level 70 version just reveals that you killed a fake version of him. Before a level 75 version appeared, spawning minions and a mini-boss Evangelist of Hate to aid him. Some guilds recalled fighting this being for 4.5 hours in the pre-nerf days, but something I will say is that the spectacle of raiding has certainly developed over time. With cutscenes and enhanced graphics, you feel a lot more immersed. Now, I wouldn't be doing raiding justice if I didn't have an honourable mention before I moved on to the next segment of the video. The tale of Absolute Virtue from Final Fantasy XI Chains of Promafia. Absolute Virtue is a notorious name that likely sends feelings of regret and disgust to many players of Final Fantasy. Being one of the longest boss battles ever, commonly known as being the longest NM, or Notorious Monster, that remained undefeated through legitimate means. I won't get into the details of it, which is probably best left for another video, but this monstrosity could take upwards of 20 hours to fight, some fights even lasting for up to 30 hours before the boss would heal himself with the majority of his HP. Eventually, when the level cap increased, the battle did become much easier, though defeating her was considered an achievement and the loot is still allegedly sought after. This boss was responsible for players coming up with many unique tactics and strategies to try and defeat it, which inevitably is what an MMO is about: cooperation.
This was not our destiny. Times change.
Raiding is a medium that has changed and evolved through the many years that it's been around, with World of Warcraft being at the forefront of being very accessible for players of any skill and talent, with other MMOs like Final Fantasy becoming the same. Most raids in modern MMOs follow a similar base formula, having 3 base roles of tanks, healers and damage dealers. Other roles can be buffing, crowd control and interrupting spellcasts, with some MMOs offering support roles that specialise in that category. The early days of World of Warcraft raiding were simpler and didn't have tactics that were overly complicated as long as everyone done what they were supposed to. One of WoW's first raids in Ixtia's Lair was a single boss raid that focused on killing the titular dragon. Originally a level 60 40-man raid that required a achievement quest to be completed. While by many it wasn't seen as a tough fight in the sense of health or damage requirements, the fight was mechanically difficult, requiring precise coordination and direction for tanks, DPS and healers.
DPS, slowly! Come here, you fucking cunt! Touch the tail!
Well,
Crush him was fair than Zurich.
Who the fuck was that?
This type of organisation was even more prevalent in a raid that was released alongside Ixtia's Lair, which was Molten Core, the then home of Ragnaros the Firelord before he grew legs, and was the most difficult content in the game before Blackwing Lair was released. This also had a lengthy attunement quest in order to enter the raid, and this allowed 40 players to enter and take their chance of bringing down Ragnaros the Firelord. Every boss had different mechanics and groups had to come up with different ways of bringing them down. Some demanded that certain effects be dispelled, others that ads had to be interrupted. All mechanics that to this day have remained within the game and have been built upon in some ways, having far-reaching effects to modern raids and dungeons within the game. Even comparing Molten Core to the latest raid within WoW now, which is Aberrus the Shadowed Crucible, it just shows you how much the playstyle of raiding has evolved, especially within an ecosystem that is constantly changing as balancing changes are done by Blizzard. Mechanics have become more complex and require more input by individuals, sometimes to the point of if someone doesn't do something specific, you can easily wipe the entire group. And WoW has certainly went through many different phases and has had many unique boss fights. To name some examples, you've got the Lich King where the platform shrinks and you need to go inside the Lich King's blade to do certain mechanics, even to the point where your character dies and is brought back to life in order to kill him. Blackhand being a multi-level fight where you drop down a layer at 66% and then once again at 33%, leading to a do or die fight atop a burning molten rock. Argus, where you quite literally fight a Titan, which is a type of god within WoW's universe, and once again you die and are brought back to kill it. getting aid from different titans in the process. Yogg-Saron, an old god that's imprisoned at the bottom of a vault with its roots embedded deep within the land, and you visit memories of the past to combat the paranoia that Yogg-Saron tries to use to make you insane. The final boss I'll mention here is what many have considered to be the most difficult in WoW's history, which is Unath in the Crucible of Storms. Taking a staggering 731 pulls on Mythic difficulty to kill, it was mainly down to one mechanic: unstable resonance. This ability affected more than half the raid and forced people to avoid teammates who had a different resonance type from themselves, and if they touched, a lethal explosion would happen that would ultimately cause people to die. Now with most MMOs, they follow a generic format and raid composition, but some do break away from that mold, and one of them is old school RuneScape. Old school RuneScape raids are unique, at least in my opinion. I won't go into the specifics as this video would genuinely be too long, but with RuneScape, you aren't tied to a specific class or style of combat. You can wield all three types: range, magic and melee. And due to the high level nature of raids in RuneScape, you need to bring equipment for all three styles to perform well. As described before, raids in RuneScape break away from that mold, with raids scaling based on the team's number and skills. An example of this is in the game's first raid, Chambers of Xeric, in which the team's overall skill total determines what resources can appear and what requirements are needed to complete puzzle runes. The layout of these raids all differ slightly. The Theatre of Blood is pretty much a raid of attrition, and Tombs of Masca having several puzzles that you need to solve before you finish the raid or even access some bosses. Raids have been received very well from the RuneScape community, and it's refreshing to see how they took a unique spin on their own version of raids, breaking from the mold to allow players more challenging content with the possibility of expensive and amazing rewards. Another game that does raids differently is Destiny 2. Destiny 2 raids once again move from the traditional format. Raids are limited to 6-player instances, requiring high levels of communication and knowing how to play your class well, with these raids offering climatic encounters against various bosses, culminating final battles against legendary bosses that have major impacts to the story. The difficulty doesn't end with just a 6-player limit. Oftentimes raid enemies will have unique abilities not found anywhere else in the game, can take several hours, don't have objective markers which make you need to figure out what to do and where to go just by yourself. Regular raids within the game allow you to die and be revived during the course of a fight with a 30-second wait. Something to briefly mention that's involved with a lot of different MMOs but I've only witnessed myself with World of Warcraft and Destiny 2 are Wild First raids. Competitive raiding at its finest. These usually have esports teams trying to clear content as fast as possible to become the Wild First to complete it and gain unique rewards that no one else can gain access to. This is a growing field and will continue for a long time, I imagine, with thousands of viewers watching these teams take on challenges and die continuously for many hours. Raiding has a long and complex history, with many different iterations and different games, more than I could fit into this video for the sake of length. If there's enough interest, there might be more deep dives into the raiding of certain MMOs, but we'll see. But for now, thanks for watching, and see you next time.
An illusion. Empty promises. Leading us only to oblivion.